Back in the early days of League, both the laning phase and the mid to late game were far different to today. The laning phase was more of a powering up stage of the game where power was very limited, both in an ease of access manner like mana and how you couldn't just spam your abilities because you would run out of mana quickly, or how burst-based mobility like dashes were less common so the damage was harder to get off, but also in a more direct sense like how Runes Reforged added an absurd amount of damage into the game straight from level 1, or how abilities are more defined in their use to front-load the damage into the early game, compared to the old idea of every ability being an option and having much more power through their scalings in how you build. Gone are the days of buying 10 health and mana potions over the course of the laning phase and junglers being punished for ganking. The mid to late game, on the other hand, is still typically the point in the game where grouping becomes more necessary as Baron becomes available, death timers are longer, and people have a lot more power to be able to siege quicker. But where it differs is in the general game state. For example, damage was a lot lower, which meant fights required more team composition for synergies and wombo combos that give you a stronger late game team fighting presence, where champions like Teemo or Rengar that were more self-centered would often put their team at a disadvantage later, or one of the most notable aspects, which was how the item system worked. Because for those that forgot or just never knew, the item system was very different in 3 very significant ways. Being that it had a more healthy balance between damage and survivability, that CDR as a stat was very poorly implemented, and that it had far fewer options due largely in part to the philosophy of more one-dimensional items for open-endedness, which meant people are often kind of just forced to go into the defensive-only items that provided no damage, like Guardian Angel, Sunfire, or Randuin's, simply because there were less options. And all of this together is what originally created the idea of lane bullies and scalers. Lane bullies were essentially champions that, as the name implies, could bully the lane and get an early lead, but would end up falling off as the game went on because what made them strong in the laning phase wasn't nearly as good in the setting of the more coordinated team fighting stage of the game. The most notable of these aspects was having more of an emphasis on their abilities, which made them more burst oriented due to their power needing to be more front loaded compared to basic attacks with their very short cooldowns. And this is where the item system lacking CDR really hit the most. Whereas the basic attack-centric champions like Jax and Aurelia started building items that were properly suited for them, the ability-centric champions kind of just ended up falling off because the items they built weren't nearly as good for them, and during their fairly long cooldowns, they would start to get beat out more and more as the consistent damage-based champions got more and more items. But as more items in general were added, as CDR was put on more and more items, as the Season 6 and 7 class updates for assassins and tanks happened, as mana was degraded further and further, as more damage was pushed into the early game, as mobility was power crept, as junglers were forced to gank more and more, and so many other changes, it meant that old idea of ability-centric champions being strong early and then falling off later was slowly lost with each new update. The scalers and consistent damage-based champions like marksmen and fighters were slowly edged out of the game in favor of more burst-oriented champions, and whether on purpose or just through a scenario of "this feels good so we should do it," many of those consistent damage-based champions ended up being pushed more and more into bursts to fit the power creep. It's why the crit items had AD pushed super heavily onto every item, while attack speed was degraded more and more, essentially fighting fire with fire in an effort to make marksmen viable again, since they couldn't really just forget and ignore them like they did the fighters due to the entire idea of marksmen being basic attack-centric. And this is also why I think we should either completely scrap the idea of lane bullies and scalers altogether, or why we need to fix the balance of burst and consistency again, because it's no longer a natural product of the game and is completely artificial, only serving to create a scenario where someone is getting stat checked because the lane bully stat checks you early, and then the scaler stat checks you later. So then what could we do to fix this? Well, the solution could be to make attack speed viable again, whether that means supporting them with brand new items, especially for the fighters that were kind of just forgotten, or reworking all of the items again. But personally, I'm not a fan of this solution because all it does is feed into the power creep, which is why I think the second solution of bringing burst down is a far better solution. To do this, we should define CDR as a primary stat in the items that it's on, for example making Black Cleaver and Spear Shojin 25 damage items, while at the same time removing CDR from all of the items that it shouldn't be on, most notably the assassin items, which are by design meant to be burst-oriented items. This means Zed and Talon need to make the conscious decision of burst or consistency, which both come with their own downsides. And the same should go for attack speed, where we remove a lot of the AD from their items and make attack speed the centerpiece stat. Anyway, thanks for sticking around to the end. I now have a Discord if you want to join and ask me any questions or just talk about game design, and I also created a Twitch channel where I'll probably be streaming now and then, so join me there where I'll be streaming right after the release of this video if you want to ask me any questions or just hang out. Subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.